first. Okay. Hi, everyone. So we are excited to have Andrew Gibbons on for today's episode of Collective Intellectuality. Andrew is professor at the School of Education at Auckland University of Technology. His work creatively and distinctively focused on philosophy of education, early childhood education, and science fiction. Andrew is involved in several professional organizations, including Association of Visual Pedagogies and Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia, and was recently named a PESA Fellow. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi there.
So Andrew, we'd like to just start with a really general question in terms of how you would describe your work. How do you describe what you do?
I've been thinking a little bit about this, thinking about meeting with you guys and talking about my work. And every time I think about a description of my work, it changes. So what I'm about to say now, I probably won't have thought about in any other time. It's organic, it's always evolving, and it shifts in relation to the things I read and the experiences I have in my teaching. I mean, also obviously experiences that we have outside of our teaching too. But at the moment, I would regard it as intentionally playful and informed by popular culture that takes seriously scholarship within philosophy of education, but also recognise that scholarship is also an engagement with the wider world. So I don't feel the necessity to kind of be in any way whatever you might think of as a pure philosopher of education. So I enjoy being motivated and driven and guided by, you know, little moments, little engagements, lots of children's TV. Was talking today about the importance of Mary Poppins to the philosophy of education. So yeah, I mean, those are some examples. And probably I go for breadth rather than depth in relation to engaging with the philosophy of education as a field. Try and get a little bit of everything rather than throwing myself too deeply in and becoming a kind of a Foucauldian or whatever you might want to be. And most people don't admit to being Foucauldians, and Foucault wouldn't have. But also you do see some people really making a career out of engagement with one or a group of philosophers, whereas I'm kind of keen to soak it all up and see what I can do with it.
A lot of what you do is in early childhood education, and why, what attracted you to thinking about early childhood education and philosophy, and why is early childhood education an important side of philosophical reflection?
I love working within the philosophy of ed and early childhood because there's just so many ongoing debates and questions in relation to, for instance, the connection between care and education. There are lots of challenges in the early childhood sector in relation to, competing forces around economics, politics, and the tension between practice and theory as well. All of which I think really, they really push me to see and develop good philosophical questions. I want to say also that when I started out as an early childhood teacher and then moved into further study, and I never thought I was going to end up in philosophy. I saw myself as a policy analyst initially when I started my master's. I had this desire to, in particular, look at inclusive education policy as a result of some of my experiences working in social work. So I really wanted to do education policy analysis, but I ended up having to take a philosophy of education paper because there was no other paper I could take at the time allowing for my schedule. So I walked into this course having studied no philosophy whatsoever, and meeting Jim Marshall and Michael Peters and Peter Roberts, and just my life changed. Meeting people who could inspire you, offer you ideas, hand over the reins as well. They were the kinds of mentors and philosophers who were just kind of really open to you getting on board and taking philosophy in your own way. Um, so that's kind of how it happened. But I also recognized that philosophy of education and early childhood education, within teacher education in particular, but also within my field as a teacher, there wasn't a lot of early childhood academics working in that field. I mean, there were, and perhaps asking questions, but not through traditional philosophy of ed modes of inquiry. So when I'd go to a conference, and my colleague Sandy Farquhar and I would often have this discussion about where we saw ourselves. Were we in the philosophy of, did we go to the philosophy of ed significant interest group, or did we go to the ECE one, and felt we were in a kind of no space? But that's changed a lot over the last 15 to 20 years. Colleagues like Marek Tessa, really led the way at creating these awesome connections between philosophy of education and early childhood education, so that you don't see these boundaries anymore. I think that's great. I'm always motivated by what philosophy can bring to early childhood education, both within the institution, within teacher education, but also in childhood studies and policy studies. And I'm glad I didn't end up in policy studies, I have to say. Not that philosophy of education isn't contributing heavily to policy analysis. I think I haven't given up on policy, but yeah, I enjoy reading philosophy of ed texts more than I enjoy reading policy analysis texts.
Yeah, and
Go
speaking
ahead,
to
Amy.
that, I mean, well, because it's interesting how you said there's kind of like, you felt like there was this in-between space between, do you go to philosophy of education interest, or do you go ECE? So coming from a, early childhood education perspective, I think it might be interesting to hear, even though you say breadth rather than depth, but what philosophers and theorists then have been influential, would you say, in the development of your work? And then adding on, where is that going now with philosophy and theorists?
Yeah. So probably, I mean, this is again, I mean, I'll think of some and I'll forget some in terms of readings and authors and influences, but I would definitely, I just want to acknowledge the lecturers I had as a early childhood teacher educator in the first year of a new diploma at the Auckland College of Education. As an early childhood student teacher, that my lecturers, really encouraged questioning. I was a terrible student in relation to producing my assignments on time or in any kind of tidy way, but I think that I feel that they appreciated that I was particularly interested in the conversations and the questions, and it was a fairly new sector in tertiary education in its configuration of a 3-year degree. So they encouraged me to ask questions, and in particular also to engage with key scholars in terms of kaupapa Māori theory. I remember being heavily influenced by Leone Pihama and the work of Graham and Linda Smith. But at that stage, I also didn't see myself as a student. I mean, I just wanted to go and work in early childhood. And like I say, I was a pretty bad student. It's ironic that I've ended up in teacher education. When I finished my diploma, I was like, I'm out of here. Hold on, sorry, there's an interruption. You can try and turn off your Microsoft Teams, but it always wants to turn itself back on. We'll get to the philosophy of technology a little bit later. I'm going to track back a bit, and this is where the science fiction comes in. My English teachers, when I was in secondary school and in high school, they introduced me to Orwell and Huxley, and that radically changed my thinking. And then, so I suddenly saw school in a quite different way. So I've always understood the value of science fiction for inviting you to see, in cliched terms, the matrix. And then moving on from that, realizing I wasn't really connected to the education system in school and looking for learning outside of it, I looked in popular culture for for bands and movies and books and and people to change the way I was thinking. When I got into philosophy of education, as I was saying, by accident, then I was introduced probably firstly to Foucault, and I found it really difficult to read Foucault, I have to say. But the distillation of Foucault through Michael and Jim and others really made sense to me. And I find myself pointing graduate students to Foucault quite regularly in terms of their engagement with power and knowledge, their engagement with discourse, and probably most importantly, the idea of like the production of the subject. So I'm always interested in encouraging student teachers and graduate students to look at, what kind of child subject is being produced within different configurations. So Foucault was probably the first. Then Lyotard and Derrida jumped in there, I'd have to say. Then when I started my PhD, my primary supervisor, Jim, had suggested I do a whole thesis on revisiting Rousseau, which I didn't want to do. I actually wanted to study the debates around the use of technology in early childhood education, and got that approved as a proposal. I'm now wondering why I didn't take Jim's advice, but anyway. For 3 of the 4 years of my PhD, I refused to read Heidegger. I said I'm not going to do that to my supervisors, and they were fine with that. And then eventually, I thought, oh, maybe I should read a little bit of The Question Concerning Technology, and had to almost entirely rewrite my thesis. But it was a really important text to read. So, Question Concerning Technology and Building Dwelling Thinking, I think, were powerful pieces. I mean, I've read Question Concerning Technology another 3 or 4 times, and Foucault's hard to read. Well, Heidegger's, yeah. And I think maybe someone could potentially see the influence of reading Heidegger in my own writing, like possibly. I don't know, is that something you can say about yourself? But no one's ever said that in a peer review, of course. You sound like you've read too much Heidegger. And the person I haven't mentioned yet, but it certainly influences my thinking and my work, is Camus. So it was working with Peter Roberts on the possibility of using Camus' work in the philosophy of education that really, excited me into getting away from being overly reliant on analytical continental traditions and philosophy of ed, and allowing myself to immerse myself in the less traditional, more popular and more fictionally focused philosophers. So, I've loved applying the story of Meursault to education. I've loved looking at La Peste, the plague. I mean, obviously that's been quite convenient for anyone writing during the pandemic. So yeah, and then every children's story I read, I can see awesome philosophy of education, and whether it's a good story or not. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I mean, I find it interesting what you had said earlier about being in between, not knowing if you're in the philosophy of education or early childhood education, because so much of I'm not myself too familiar with early childhood education, but it seems like, going back to Rousseau or something and thinking about Dewey, what the stuff I've read with Dewey, and then with people like J.S. Neal, and it seems like there's a long kind of tradition of philosophy of early childhood, or at least the child. And then it seems like you were saying, well, there just wasn't as much activity or interest in early childhood education within philosophy. So I guess this question is kind of, how are philosophers like yourself and others perhaps now to rethinking some of the questions that have been longstanding in early childhood education. And we were curious, especially about questions concerning like play, because that's a kind of longstanding site of thinking about early childhood education. So yeah, how would you respond to some of those comments, questions?
I remember, I remember thinking about like Rousseau's work and its like quite tacit influence in relation to this construction of the early childhood curriculum in this country and elsewhere perhaps, but definitely like there's a lot of ideas about childhood that resonate with, for instance, this idea of the importance of the child playing in nature. And it's not just Rousseau, it's obviously also Froebel. And Froebel's probably had a more explicit influence over some trends and traditions and dogma in this country in relation to early childhood education. Perhaps the best way to explain it as a challenge in this country is that often philosophy is talked about as a having of a position rather than the asking of a question. So philosophy is something that you have to write as a statement of values and beliefs. And I'm not saying that's not philosophy, but to me, it's not philosophical work. So you read Rousseau in teacher education, in early childhood teacher education, and are asked to then say what you believe, rather than to read Rousseau and think about what Rousseau was exploring at the time in relation to social contracts, in relation to a concern for the industrial impact on childhood. So it's like, Rousseau's set in some kind of weird stone. That then means that people reading Rousseau now go, oh, I wouldn't want to read Rousseau because that doesn't really make any sense, rather than understanding that what Rousseau was doing, certainly was full of like quite hardline beliefs about nature, about the world, about childhood, but also started with, where are we going with the Industrial Revolution? Where are we going with the development of the citizen and the community, and what does that mean for the child? Same with Froebel. So to me, what's happened is that not just a teacher, but also a whole early childhood centre has to develop a philosophy statement, which means they engage in quite particular ways with philosophers of education, searching through them for something that they can then write down on paper to say, this is our philosophy, rather than we do philosophical work. So if they don't like or can't make sense of Rousseau, which is quite possible, or Foucault, or and I'm using a narrow range of there's a narrow demographic in what I'm talking about here as well. I recognize that. So those traditional philosophers that are produced in the curriculum, they don't necessarily speak to the people who are writing their philosophy statements on one level, but also the fact that they're even being asked to write philosophy statements is something of a performance that maybe undermines the potential, although I don't like the word potential, of philosophy of education for teaching, for teacher education. The other thing I was thinking in relation to that. Oh, and by the way, if you could imagine, like, every time you read a school or a centre philosophy statement, Whitney Houston, singing "I believe the children are our future," it makes me well up with tears, but it also makes me realise how cliched some of these philosophy statements are. And so, yeah, so the other thing is to realise that there's a colonising process going on in the relation to the philosophy of education that, is hugely ironic. When we turn now to post-structuralism and post-humanism and like new materialist methodologies, because, for instance, for Māori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's like being told, okay, well, after 150 odd years or so, after this amount of colonization, the academy is now realizing the error of its ways, but and turning to ways of thinking about the world that were actually suppressed, very viciously, by the British as they arrived, and this is in a week of the nation being invited to. We're having a day off in a couple of weeks to remember the Queen. So now's a good moment to realize that when colonial ships arrived, they arrived with an idea about philosophy and about science that is being that is being replaced slowly, chip by chip, but in ways that don't recognize the knowledge that was already here. So yeah, I would love to be. I mean, Rose Petty, for instance, her works and her work around different models of understanding life and the child and the cosmos should be quite familiar to someone who's trying to make sense of new material ways of thinking. Yeah, I don't know quite what my point is there, other than to perhaps recognize the terrible and tragic irony of where we're at in relation to philosophy of education and our colonial past. Well, present. What am I talking about? Our colonial now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of, with that, it kind of, you brought up technology and how also not only a philosophy of education can be, it still has a colonizing tendency, and it also almost fixing, like it's making things rigid, where's the playfulness and thinking through ideas and productive playfulness where it's doing something, not for the sake of getting to the end point, but rather for the sake of doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I'll speak for myself. When I'm reading your work, especially with using science fiction, it almost starts inviting in the speculative thinking of how can we think differently through thinking philosophically rather than, oh, here's my position, I'm doing philosophy. And I wanted to bring up your book, which has one of the best titles, and I'm very jealous of it, but The Matrix Ate My Baby. Every time I read that title, I think it's just 100% great. But you do think about the question of technology, thinking philosophically, the child, and through, say, science fiction as a frame. Can you discuss what science fiction offers for thinking about childhood and child education that maybe, taking those philosophical positions may not?
I can.
Or why do you like to use science fiction? Also, would be the two.
Yeah. I'm thinking about. Okay, so I mean, obviously, as I said before, science fiction was a way for me to recognize a discontent with my high schooling, and so I found a voice in relation to things that had been concerning me. And I was successful at high school. I was being managed and produced by the high school, not to be an early childhood teacher, that's for sure. I don't think that would have been their vision for me, and they would have had one. And yeah, so I remember talking to my dean at the time, after, hey. I remember talking to my dean at the time, when I realized that school wasn't for me, and suggesting I might leave school, and the dean saying, yeah, I think that's a good idea, I think you should go. So the first thing is that science fiction got me out of education and into education in an institutional space, and into an idea of teaching and learning, through organic connections around interest and passions. So that that was that was the first step. Movies like Blade Runner just compelled me to watch them again and again and again, and then read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep again and again and again, and get different things out of them, and get angry with them, and realize that you've missed things in them. Like, especially with Do Androids Dream, there's some things that each time I read it, I go, how did I not notice this the first time? And then to understand, like, the questions that are key for those writers, well, that writer, Philip K. Dick, but also that then transfer into, a film that's just an awesome film for asking and inviting questions. I mean, when Blade Runner came out, it did not get a good reception, but it's become, obviously quite a different thing. But I'll watch any piece of science fiction and get something out of it. Like, I mean, I don't really call, although maybe it's not my position to call anything science fiction or not, I don't really call Star Wars science fiction. It's kind of fantasy. It's it doesn't on the surface represent strong science fiction questions and narratives, but R2-D2 and C-3PO, right, to me, like, engaging carefully in an analysis of their conversations in movies that otherwise are healthily disrespected, like, the first three, which are obviously, everyone finds it difficult to deal with Anakin's growth, and and find some of the characters problematic. But when R2-D2 and C-3PO are talking about what it means to be human and what it means to be machine, like, because they're so subtle, you go back to them again and again and go, why are they having this conversation about and very contradictory statements that C-3PO makes to R2-D2 about decision making and humanity and artificial intelligence. So I'm always looking for that. So I'll go prospecting for that gold in any rubbish that I can find. Well, that I find it's a terrible movie. Like, I'm not really enjoying it, but I'll watch it again and again just to see things. And then if I think about specifically early childhood science fiction, like when I was writing my PhD, I started to realize that one way in which I'm going to have to engage with children in their digital worlds is to look at the projection of those digital worlds through new media, through television in particular, and through film. So I was quite lucky at the time that Digimon was being released. So I got to watch a lot of Digimon. And the good thing about Digimon is it did really put to children questions concerning the real and the artificial, and the relationship that children have, in ways that would suggest that whoever the writers were, they had an understanding of Sherry Turkle's work, for instance, from MIT, like, just in terms of care for the artificial world, care for material, and care for machines, and the changing nature of humanity and the more than human in relation, that's really super in Digimon. And then you get the benefit of also seeing that Digimon steps out of itself and says, okay, here's a child that plays the game, plays the card game, and then creates their own card, and then ends up in the storyline, which really kind of plays on blurring those boundaries. So Digimon was great. I was also at the same time watching Dragon Ball Z, which is not about the digital world, but I particularly also enjoyed because of its capacity to slow time down, like to watch one fight scene that would take 7 episodes and be just like, powering up, anyway. People did question whether or not I was spending my doctoral research productively by watching these shows, and that comes back to that question, or that observation you had, Amy, about being productively playful in your work. Like I can't undermine observations or concerns around like the privilege of playfulness. So when people are like questioning how it is that you can have fun when you do things, when what we do is serious, but also for me it's vital to do that, and it's vital to share and encourage that, and to suggest that we can look there's no formula for being fun and playful in your philosophical work, but there shouldn't be a burden to do that either, otherwise it then becomes just another criterion to tick off in a peer review. Did I have fun reading this article, or did they engage with fun correctly in order to get published? And that's not what I want, but certainly, like, I think we need to allow for the possibility that humor and playfulness and fun have an important role to play.
And you also, you draw on science fiction, analytically, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. So we have one question here, which is, what is Franken education? And how has science run amok? This is a case of you taking up science fiction and literature and using it as an analytical, philosophical, not analytical philosophy, but analytical philosophical tool. And maybe you could talk a little bit about those themes and the importance of those themes and what you do.
So the concern within science fiction for the role of science is one that motivates me in terms of analysis of the sciences of education, or how, like behavioral sciences in particular, how they contribute to an attempt to create a particular kind of child subject, and how they might, if we think of the teacher or the school leader or the centre head teacher or the policymaker is always potentially going to end up in some kind of Victor Frankenstein role, where they want to produce this perfection. They want to show they can create something that's a beautiful human, and what's likely to happen as a result. So I've been mainly concerned with using science fiction to tell a story about our anxieties in education, to produce a particular kind of subject, or to resolve a particular kind of problem. And that's become increasingly also influenced by a reading on, I guess, like control and predictability. So David Kupferman is really keen to continue writing about control societies as the ongoing projects, and we haven't had time to do it up till this stage. But everywhere it's popping up. So, like during 3 weeks of recovery from COVID, I decided I was going to try my hardest not to work, and found myself working through reading Dan Simmons's Hyperion and Endymion series, and in that it engages really thoroughly with the problem of a society that's determined to create a predictability godhead, that nothing is ever going to be left to chance. And I think one way to get to that through a more traditional philosophy of education approach would be to read, for instance, Kurt Biester's The Beautiful Risk of Education, and is writing all about the problems of measurement societies. So for me, I've been engaged in what goes wrong when you attempt to perfect things, and you believe that you can possibly predict and then control all potential educational outcomes. So that's one way. There's two ways I use it. So firstly, science fiction that engages with the Promethean problem, and then science fiction that engages with the algorithmic problem. It's everywhere around us, and then it brings us back to Heidegger as well. And like he writes beautifully. I can't remember in which text about the curious excess of frantic measurement, and for me at the moment in Aotearoa New Zealand, there's a real there's a real swell of that anxiety and excess, and it's led to investing in international programs for behavior management of children that that try and detect and then eradicate behaviors that are considered to be like conduct disorder. So there was an attempt a few years back by the Ministry of Education to have a national screening of 4-year-olds for conduct disorder. I mean, there's the material where science fiction is going to offer us some kind of like play with where that's going to go. But it also helps, science fiction also helps to reveal what's under those kinds of anxieties. Fortunately, we resisted the national screening, but it's come up in new ways. Now we have social competence progress tools like seeping in. So so every 3-year-old and 4-year-old is going to have to be observed and treated with social competence progress tools.
Well, there's an interesting tension between the fact that all colleges of education have to do that performative statement of values in their philosophy of education statements, but yet the administrative logics that prevail in many of these policies that are rolled out and then implemented and adopted are so instrumental, so guided by logics like the Frankenstein logic of the fantasy of being able to master nature and control it, predict it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's that seems to me somewhat of an interesting tension that can be easily sort of legitimated, narrated, justified in highly sort of progressive or humanistic language, but yet at its base is it's instrumental and so I find that somewhat interesting.
I mean, there's such a dislike of science fiction that it's actually quite a challenging approach. When I bring up science fiction in the class, it's not normally pretty effective. So I have to find ways of using science fiction, but not advocating for science fiction. In a lecture theatre of a couple of hundred, there might be 4 or 5 students who are already keen on science fiction. So they see this as an invitation and a release, and you can see them kind of light up and go, "Oh, I can do that." But the rest of the class, at least based on just visuals, is like, what? Why are we doing this? So some of the ways that I experiment with this, and I've been talking with my great colleague Amy about this, is developing things like empathy tests as playful experiments around how to engage student teachers, not in science fiction, but in the sorts of questions that science fiction invites us to ask about. For instance, what is empathy, and how does a teacher show empathy? And should we take an instrumental approach to empathy so that we know that every teacher walks in with a definable and observable and measurable and accessible and developmentable, or whatever the word is, approach to their empathy. And so often the way I do that is by asking them how they feel about the possibility that an algorithm is going to eventually replace them as a teacher, and what they think that they bring that's not programmable, that's not codable. And so that gets the conversation going much better than if I talk to them about Blade Runner, or there's one of Philip K. Dick's novels, Martian Time Slip. There's the father of the child on Mars is reflecting on the benefits and costs of robot teachers. He's sitting on the fence in some ways, but also there's a melancholia for for a past where the teacher was human. My question to the student teachers is, what's actually human about you in relation to your study? If your study is very technical and instrumental in terms of your centre or classroom practice.
I mean, I think that's really interesting too when you bring up the empathy. I think about what if you did that test, but where do you see too with science fiction as being possibly, I don't want to say like a tool, but maybe a way in to complicate or maybe make known how already the way that education policy and how you're saying in Aotearoa, New Zealand, how there are these behavior modifications where it's almost like, what's the empathy rubric? You know, how are you going to teach that to a child? But then presenting a counterpoint, well, what if we think about empathy through a science fiction lens to kind of, I guess, maybe unsettle with the student teachers in early childhood education? I wonder how you see that working.
That's the challenge, I guess, for my work, is to to share the benefit. I mean, because of neither the philosophy of education in terms of Dewey or Rousseau or Foucault or Barrard in terms of recent developments, and particularly in early childhood education, if that's something that at this stage seems inaccessible in some way, or if science fiction seems inaccessible in some way, then my role or my motivation is the challenge to address the apparent inaccessibility, and that's my ongoing daily, nightly, wake up in the middle of the night, go, oh, I know, I'll try this kind of challenge. Like, how about showing that piece of work, or how about asking these kinds of questions? But my task isn't to advocate for science fiction, I guess. It's to advocate for engagement with something that that nourishes your questions and your openness to your practice as a teacher, or your commitment to your community, or whatever, I guess. And doing it in a way that recognizes people's stories, their narratives, their the things that both make possible and impossible engagements with particular kinds of genres or particular kinds of media.
So Andrew, what is an impossible philosophy of education? And how does this idea of an impossible philosophy of education, how does it, what does it help us understand about our current sort of catastrophic condition that we find ourselves in today?
So that's quite a new, I mean, a good and new question for me. I am working with a group of colleagues on impossible. So what's almost impossible or barely imaginable, but you have imagined it. So therefore, how could you then take up that seemingly impossible something and use it to question and to challenge and to reveal our predicament, or our predicament, maybe not ours. I mean, and that's where I guess I love the work of Ursula Le Guin for taking something that at the moment might be regarded as, well, that's not going to happen, but weaving it into the now.
You were talking about Ursula Le Guin and an impossible philosophy of education, and trying to think that concept in relation to our catastrophic condition, climate, I mean, by which we mean climate change, threats of nuclear war, financial meltdown, all the other stuff we're sort of authoritarianism, all the other stuff that we're sort of dealing with today.
Yeah, so the work around impossible, and the seemingly impossible, or the unimaginable, is sorry, I'm nervous that I'm going to lose you.
Okay.
Whatever I say, if it shuts us down again, it's because of what I say. So let's just imagine the apparent impossibility of life without the internet, or the or the apparent impossibility of immortality, which obviously science fiction is playing with all the time. And good science fiction plays with it in a quite different way to or at least science fiction that motivates me. Sorry, not good, but I'm motivated by science fiction, which wakes me up in relation to what the apparent impossibility might mean for now and today. And so I remember being at a philosophy of education conference where someone had shouted out from the audience about how we all desire to live forever, and wondering about how that desire, engaged with its apparent impossibility, drives education systems. And if anyone's really ever thought about the implications for education of immortality, like so I started working with Marta Cabral on an encyclopedia of intergalactic pedagogy based on this idea of, well, what happens for education systems, and what's possible for education systems when presented with, at least for most people, the impossibility of first contact. For other people, it's not an impossibility and it's already been and gone. So there are awesome questions for education to ask when confronted by this idea of, like, how does our curriculum change when we're faced with a very different understanding of the galaxy, of the universe, of the cosmos, of travel, of biology. What are the things that we just absolutely have no idea about, that first contact is then going to introduce and then require us to rethink in terms of education. Definitely various writers have thought about all kinds of devices for undermining how we think about education right now. For instance, even within the Matrix, the idea of just like plugging in, coding in, I know how to fly a helicopter kind of, or I know Kung Fu. Or there's a pill that you take and suddenly you know what you need to know, or you behave in the way you want to behave. But the other thing that excites me about the impossibility is just the challenge to question some things. So when I'm working, to give a really practical example, I work with student teachers in the early childhood space who take this notion of possibility and impossibility and apply it without necessarily thinking in relation to development. So I can use the device to invite them to reveal the limits that they have developed without thinking in relation to child development. What a 2-year-old or 3-year-old or an 11-year-old or an 8-year-old what's possible for them and what's impossible for them. So there's some awesome pedagogical work to do there. Yeah. It's good experimental work, and it also helps reveal some of those elements of our values and beliefs that don't end up in those position statements and don't end up on those profiles for the school or the centre. Ursula Le Guin's great for it also because of the way in which she invites science fiction to be understood as a critique of the already present. So that possible impossible connection becomes an exciting, both a thoughtful and practical experiment.
So Andrew, I think that's a good note to wrap things up with today. I want to thank you. My daughter is here and she needs to go to martial arts, so so I have to get her off to that. But it's been such a pleasure to talk to you and learn more about your work. I'm looking forward to seeing more of it.
There's a good connection to I know Kung Fu there.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen The King of Kong? I mean, there's an awesome documentary.
That's a great film. I love that film.
There's that moment where like someone who is expert in their field of playing arcade games is interrupted by fatherhood, and I need to go party. It's just like probably one of the best pieces of documentary film I've ever seen.
Yeah, that was really fun.
I've never seen a crowd of moviegoers in stitches for an entire film, just quite like I was. But anyway, okay. Thank you two for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a
Thank
pleasure.
you.